1939, they came to America. And since that time, he has done many great things and accomplished an awful lot here. He's a graduate of Georgetown University. He is a fellow. He is a fellow at the he's a Robert A. Taft Fellow for International Constitutional Studies at the Ludwig von Mises Insitute. He's an expert on international policy and economics. He is has been the associate editor of the Times of the Americas for 12 years. He has been a commentator on The Voice of America for 18 years, from 1985 to 2003, I think. He's listed in Who's Who in America and Who's Who in the World. He has written for Harvard Business Review, Washington Times, Washington Post, National Review, we won't hold that against him, Human Events, Miami Herald. He has been a director or on the advisory council of Accuracy in Media, the Conservative Caucus, that's Howard Phillips's organization, the Reason Foundation. He is fluent in at least 4 languages. We only used one of them in the interview last night. I spoke public school, that's the only one I know.
Primitive
Yeah. He is the associate publisher of the American Conservative magazine. Is anyone familiar with the American Conservative magazine? I've been a subscriber since it came out. Anyone else here get this magazine? One person? Well, guess what? We have these cards here today, and I can recommend this magazine. This is a very good magazine, and it's not monolithic in its views. I would call it a paleo-conservative magazine. Not neo-conservative, but paleo-conservative, nevertheless conservative, and maybe even a little bit of a libertarian streak in there. Although we don't want to get too cozy with those guys, but a little bit maybe. All right, ladies and gentlemen, let's give an applause and welcome Mr. Jon Utley.
Thank you very much. It's an honor to be here. And I don't really know the Midwest very well. I grew up in the Northeast, but I'm always impressed. I always like it. I guess it's the real America, as we say, us immigrants. You heard a bit of my background. My father was taken away, died in the concentration camps. My uncle was a British officer, was gassed in the First World War. Had one lung and died when he was 40 because of that, partly. I studied in Germany when I was 18, which was a few years after the Second World War, going through the bombed out cities to my studies. And I've seen a giant city, flat, if you will, East Berlin. I went with a U.S. military bus tour in 1952 through East Berlin. And the city was flat as far as the eye could see. It's not just a theory. I've seen cities like that, so it's not impossible to happen again, even. I hope never in my lifetime. I was always interested in survival, how people survived. Actually, in Germany, in the cities, about 1 million people were killed when we bombed every city in Germany over and over again. And half of those million were in Dresden and Hamburg, the firebombing. About 500,000 in those 2 cities. And most people survive. Human beings are very resilient and can go through hell and still still be alive. So people do. I've written about civil defense over the years because of that. There's a group called Doctors for Disaster Preparedness that meets once a year out west. The next meeting is in New York. And they put out a newsletter. It's scientists and doctors, and mainly on civil defense, a lot of stuff, but also on illnesses and global warming, all those threats. And it's a very interesting group if you all ever have time, and very economical to go. And I know them. I've written on civil defense. I did for Human Events in the American Legion magazine years and years ago on surviving nuclear war. I come also from South America. I lived 15 years with the terrorism. I was thinking this morning, I still, when I wash my hair in the shower, think, what if the water goes off when you got soaked in your hair? Because I've had that because of a terrorist attack somewhere, water or electricity. As an immigrant, perhaps we're most conscious of the Bill of Rights, and my objections to Bush before the president wasn't just, and the Republicans wasn't just bankrupting us in the war, but it was what they did to the Bill of Rights, and I'll go into that a little later. But as refugees from Nazi communists and all that, we're very focused. I also developed a contrarian streak. I was 5 years old when we arrived in America, and the ship came into New York Harbor at 5 in the morning. All the passengers rushed up on deck, so excited. We came in 39, and I came up and I couldn't see because they were all tall and I was a child. So I found if I walked back, and the ship was tipping over so much that I was afraid it could tip over. So I walked back to balance my weight as much as possible to the other side. But also when the ship was tilted, I could see over the heads of the grown-ups. So it made me something of a contrarian in a sense. And later in the Second World War, the terrific media promotion of communism and into the 40s, which I would then go home and hear these horrific stories. My mother and father went through the Ukraine when the children were starving to death during the collectivization. They gave away all their food and change at the railway stations to these kids. So I grew up with those kind of stories, obviously not the typical thing American kids have. The founding fathers in America, our founding fathers were very conscious of war. Our independence, the war, the Constitution was barely 100 years out of the 17th century in Europe with the horrific 30 Years' War, the religious wars. In the 30 Years' War, I think 30% of the Europeans were killed. They were conscious of wars, and the Europeans were having wars all the time. So they tried to make it difficult to start a war, saying only Congress could start wars. James Madison is a quote you probably all heard, but bear with me. Of all the enemies of public policy, of public liberty, war is perhaps the most to be dreaded because it comprises and develops the germ of every other. War is the parent of armies. From these proceed debts and taxes. And armies, debts, and taxes are the known instruments for bringing the many under the dominion of the few. No nation could preserve its freedom in the midst of continual warfare. We're seeing, of course, a lot of that today. Tom Paine had another quote, much shorter. He said, "I know not whether taxes are raised to fight wars, or wars are started in order to raise taxes." Somewhat cynical view, but the kings in Shakespeare, there's several lines where kings would start wars. And he has a line, if you have trouble at home, his advice to a king, if you have trouble at home, like intractable problems, like ours, Social Security, Medicare, the poor schools, the budget deficits, the trade deficit, when you have trouble at home, start a war abroad. And then everyone gets excited and you don't have to focus on how to resolve. Even our financial crash in 2008, if we had not been at war, the media might have had some concern in investigating other issues. You could see that was coming, incredible overpricing of speculation in real estate. Anyway, here we are today. It's also, you have to follow the money. The First World War, which began these disasters of the 20th century, American banks had loaned so much to the British, and we began to fear, our banks feared the British would lose, and that was a main reason going into the war. We had a tremendous Irish and German immigration in America, that was very opposed to going in with the Allies in the war, etc. Richard Viguerie, a friend of mine, who's French origin from his name, Viguerie was the man who started direct mail. He explained to me once the French immigration to New Orleans, where he came from, to Louisiana, was mainly French families wanting to save their sons from being drafted by the French king to fight in the wars and to lose their sons. That, of course, even through the First World War, you see, there was no appreciation of the life of the poorer people, by the nobility, etc. So even then, a big part of our immigration here was to get away from these European wars. I was a student after college in France. I was studying at the Alliance Française, and I was invited to a conference of French and German students, on an island, and the young students were wanting to meet each other. This was 52, no, it was 56, sometime after the war, but the younger people all wanted to get to know each other, to meet each other, etc. The older people, the older men, when they had a few drinks and they had scratched, they'd flare up. I used to see them with that hatred and bitterness and memories of the war. So young people have much less of that, and you see that today, even on the whole. The polling, Ron Paul is most popular with younger people under 30 who don't have the communist experience, the whole thing. They're more open. The Club Med, the holiday place, was started by two, a French and a Belgian, started that if young Europeans could meet each other internationally, they wouldn't be so susceptible to believing the elders when they're telling them how evil the neighbors, the other country, the other nationality was. The people got to know each other. And that's in the internet today, there's a lot of that. So you have, generally, Ron Paul was also had the most donations from the military, from soldiers in the field, of any candidate who are young on the whole. That's when you get, things look so bad sometimes, but there is always that movement, I think, in the whole world. In talking about wars, my field was really economics, and I used to be a journalist and write about third world economics, but wars always interested me, etc. And so I was in a meeting. We had the European Resource Bank as think tanks in Europe. I've done a lot of work of promoting free market ideas and American, if you will, form of government, limited government, a rule of law, and the basis of our prosperity overseas. There's a group called the Atlas Economic Research Foundation. We support think tanks in the third world promoting these kind of ideas. And I've always been supportive. Anyway, we had a meeting of this group of think tanks in Europe. It was in Yalta, in the Crimea, which coming from the Second World War, the Yalta Agreement. I was always curious and went there anyway. Then I went on to Sevastopol. Sevastopol is where the Crimean War was. It was an hour and a half away, and I went there for a tour of the Crimean War. And it was 1853. And one of the modern wars, if you will, like just before the American Civil War, or just before. And there's a giant mural, a picture that it's the way they did before videos, 360 degrees of art painting going in a whole building. And then in the foreground is the debris of war with dead horses and first aid stations and some cannons. And then it melds into the picture behind. Anyway, I've been curious always, the charge of the Light Brigade. And there they are in this. And they're all wearing bright red coats. And I thought, still, in our Revolutionary War, that's how we could shoot them. We didn't play fair, our guys. The British, I read now sometimes the Americans, our military complains that the guerrillas in Afghanistan aren't playing fair. They're not doing war honorably. It should be, which from that point of view, is that they line up so we can kill them easily. Yes, they don't. Anyway, the British soldiers in the charge of the Light Brigade were all wearing these bright red coats, who they picked off by snipers. And I thought, this thing that the military learns to fight, they fight the last war. When they have a war, they're using the methods of the last war. I began to think that was 75 years after our Revolutionary War. It's not that they fight the last war, they fight the war 75 years before. The First World War. Did anybody see War Horse, the movie? It is something to see what it was like there. And in the First World War, there's a book I reviewed called To End All Wars, which is a very good book about England in the First World War. Well, the commanding general was called General French, the English general, and his battle plan in the First World War was for the infantry to go and clear out the machine guns and the barbed wire so he could have a cavalry charge. Most of the British officers were cavalry officers. Ours, by the way, are mostly ex-fighter pilots in the Air Force and Navy. They were cavalry officers. Their dream was the glory of war and charge. And in the back of the poor infantry were healthy, well-fed cavalry soldiers stroking their horses, getting ready for an attack, which never came. And that's not the British. Even the German army, that was the smartest of them, had the same thing in back. And then I come to our wars. We are training, officers are still trained to fight the Second World War, which is about 75 years before. Aircraft carriers and tanks. The Army hates this guerrilla warfare type. And after Vietnam, they said never again. That's why we weren't ready when it started in Iraq. The military is naturally, when they're training, what can they train with except the way it was done in the past? But you should have a healthy skepticism of those, some of the advice they give. I remember Fox and CNN during the war in Iraq had these retired generals all saying how great the war, how good it was and how well it was going. And then the New York Times, an enterprising reporter, discovered many of them had business interests. They were on the boards of directors or executives in companies that were selling money, selling weaponry, etc. So after that story, they suddenly disappeared. As I say, Fox and CNN had them on all the time. Follow the money is always a rule. Always. As an aside, let me say, special forces. The wars I knew, my friends at college were in the Korean War. My knowledge, of course, of the Vietnam War. The special forces used to be our elite troops. They spoke foreign languages. They'd studied the culture of these countries. They went in. There was a great story in the Atlantic or Harbors about an American captain, special forces captain, going into Iraq and taking a town. And they surrendered. They thought, many of them did think America would help them. And he had the elders, the old Muslims, eating out of his hand with some respect for their culture, explaining things, just treating people with respect. It's a third world thing I'll come back to. The article went on to say after he was rotated out, some other soldiers came in, especially the 4th Division. The soldiers came after the actual war and started treating the locals like dirt, stupid idiots, etc. Anyway, we can, going to that, why we can't do it. Democracies can't run empires. If you think we're not an empire, when we have troops, there's supposedly 800 bases in other countries. Some must be very small. But we are an empire. We want the rest of the world to do what we tell them. We don't have troops like Rome and England did everywhere. But we also we are not like Rome and England as a democracy. Democracies cannot run empires. This was said, it was our founding fathers were very conscious of Athens and Rome. One of the points, Athens was the direct democracy. People get all excited and they vote one day for something, one day for something else. Athens had a surge also to Syracuse. If you go back to the Peloponnesian War, which is still interesting. Their surge was sending troops to Syracuse to try and conquer Syracuse. That was the main ally of Sparta, etc. As a child, I was 18. My mother was a writer, and with her, I went and I saw the quarry in Syracuse in Sicily, where the Athenian prisoners died. The prisoners, they finally surrendered the Athenian army, and they were put in this quarry and died of stuff, of hunger and thirst. And the Syracuse, anyway, another story, but the point was Athens bankrupted itself in fighting the war. And also Athens had an alliance. Its Athens' strength was its alliances all through the islands and different Greek colonies. They supported Athens. And then as Athens got its back to the wall, it started treating its allies with tyranny. And there was an island, I think Miletus, they sent off, it revolted, and then the Athenians sent a navy squadron with orders to kill every man, woman, and child on the island. And then the allies started separating from Athens, and that was the beginning of the end of Athens. But democracies can't run empires for all the reasons. Rome and the Republic, of course, the answer is to give up your democracy. And a king or an emperor or a communist party can run an empire, but we can't. And not to mention, it's often said we're not ruthless enough. I remember some of the generals on Fox kept saying, we got to fight like the Second World War, which means, I guess, obliterating everything. Well, you can't in today's world. With the modern media, look at us, this can be videoed and put on the internet. If there had been anything like this in communist and Nazi times, they never could have done what they did. It's just, and we as Americans are not going to tolerate the kind of brutality that was done, as happened in the Vietnam War when we saw these. Now, that's not reported so much today, but we're not, it's not who we are to do those brutalities. So, there are several reasons we should not run an empire. William Lind, if you know, Paul Weyrich was a leader of the conservatives, and his main collaborator was a man, William Lind, L-I-N-D, and he writes on fourth generation warfare and defensive warfare. In his argument, which I agree, we should have a defensive policy where, as we did with the communists, containment, if you will. The Muslim issue is that they're going through changes in the Muslim world, and they try to modernize them. They got a lot of problems. And we should not be in the middle, choosing sides. We should be following a policy of defense. And that's where, one of the points about intelligence intercepts, NSA gets all this intelligence, intercepting the conversations and much that goes on in the Muslim world. And there were reports that 90% of it is they're hating each other. Most of these countries, it's the neighbors or the ideas of others, not us. Although when we get in the middle of it, they convert it to us. One of the articles we had in our magazine, The American Conservative, which we have some copies on the back desk, there was an article by James Pinkerton, who was on Fox News, called The 7 Habits of Highly Effective Imperialists, copying, Covey's ideas. And it was very amusing and serious. Some of his points, the 7 habits: be serious about your imperialism. The great game is not for dilettantes. The great game was called with the British-Russian conflict in Central Asia. It used to be called the great game. Be serious. It's not for dilettantes. Another, get the locals to like you. And the third is be ruthless. Obviously, there's some conflict there. But it's not impossible. Imperialism, the British imperialists were always based on having the locals fight each other. And then the British would stay in the background, or they'd make a deal with one group of locals to dominate another. The Sikhs they had in India. Anyway, it's a complicated business, and you need people who are students of history, who have learned, studied these issues. Not our system. We have officers that go in and rotate out. After 1 year, an officer is rotated out. Now, in the third world, everything is based on personal contacts. The evolution in the West was a rule of law. There's some trust, but if you're in business, you know, the law may say something, but are you going to go to court for 5 years and spend tens of thousands of dollars? And in the end, it's personal contacts too, even in our society. But in the third world, where there's no rule of law in many countries, everything is based upon their judgment of personal relations. So one of our problems is we go in, we have very well-meaning and intelligent and capable officers, and they finally establish some rapport with the local tribesmen, and the tribal elders begin to trust them, etc. And then they're rotated out. Their tour of duty's up. And a new guy comes in, of course they don't speak the language usually. One of the great problems, so in the end they don't trust us. To run an empire effectively, you need people who are going to go and stay in these countries. I only learned recently the British Empire was really staffed by Scotch and Irish, who were the poorest in the British Isles and were willing to go overseas for the opportunity. And that was the staffing of the empire. And they would stay there. Another point that Pinkerton had, send your children to learn foreign languages. If you're going to occupy these countries, Pashtun, and that doesn't mean French and Spanish. It's Pashtun and Pashto and all these things. Obviously, we're not serious about running the world. We don't want to pay that price, etc. I'd add that a problem we have also in our foreign policy is the people who make American foreign policy are people who care about it. On the whole, it's lobbies. The people who care most are immigrants who come from these countries. Here in the Middle East, often you hear the Israeli lobby, but there are many other lobbies. The Armenian lobby. We nearly had the whole Congress pass a law condemning Turkey, which the Turks were up in arms about, because of a tiny group of Armenians in California got that passed. The war with Kosovo in Serbia, there were some Albanian American students that set up a public affairs office and spoke very well, explaining why we had to go to war to save Kosovo. By the way, all these wars have been built on lies. It's not just what we know about Iraq and the weapons of mass destruction. In Kosovo, we were told that 100,000 Kosovans had been murdered by the Serbs. This is what I'm even forgotten now. When we went to war, it was all a lie, it wasn't true, and so on. The NATO, the expansion of NATO, which did so much to damage our relations with Russia, we now have, with the expansion of NATO, they're armed F-16s flying minutes away from St. Petersburg. They're on the Baltic countries' borders. Flying minutes away. Imagine if we had planes based in Canada or Mexico flying, fighter bombers flying a few minutes from our cities. We'd be screaming. That's what we did to Russia. The expansion of NATO was done in the Clinton administration mainly to get Polish and other Central European votes in the Midwest for the election coming up. When I lived in Peru, it was tuna fishermen nearly made a break in relations with the whole of Peru because the tuna fishermen were inside the 200-mile limit, which Peru was claiming. Tuna fishermen from the West Coast. So the foreign policy, we're not thinking it out like the British and Romans. And by the way, England, in the 19th century, only 4% of the population could vote. It was a democracy of sorts. But it was not the mass of people deciding their foreign policy. The same, when in the First World War, women did not have the vote in England in 1914. It came later. So there's half the population, etc. Another topic on the issue of war, I think, is Sun Tzu, was the famous Chinese historian and philosopher of war, S-U-N-T-Z-U. He's considered, even today, all military study his works. And I wrote an article. I was curious how he would have looked at our wars. So I read him again. I hadn't for years. And I wrote an article, Sun Tzu and America's Way of War. And it really got around, because if you search just Sun Tzu America, you come to my article at the top of Google. And Sun Tzu had some interesting comments about winning a war. His main one was, know thyself and know thy enemy. Well, know thyself means we have to know our strengths and our limitations. Know thy enemy. Who cares? I mean, who wants to really learn about these tribes? And which tribe hates the tribe the most, and which has the vengeance, and which is the most aggressive, which is the bravest. Anyway, know thy enemy. Learn his languages. Toughest part for us, probably. If you know the enemy and know yourself, you need not fear the results of 100 battles. If you know yourself, but not the enemy, for every victory gained, you will also suffer a defeat. If you know neither the enemy nor yourself, you will succumb in every battle. Well, we have not won against guerrilla wars. I have also written on that, why we can't win guerrilla warfare, based on a Cato lectures they had, quoting military sources on our problems. But that's Sun Tzu, that's his general advice. The next, one of his main points is a great general wins without going to war. If you think about it, when starting a war, one never knows where it goes. The people who started wars, think of Hitler and the Japanese, it all ended far different from what they thought. When the First World War was started, there's a scene in the book I mentioned, a German officer telling German students, now's your chance, you come in, volunteer for the army, it'll be over in 6 months, you'll be back to your studies, and you'll have had the great glory and the experience of being an officer. It would become in our army and all that. The First World War, there were demonstrations in the streets of the capitals demanding war. The war that killed unbelievable numbers. Every English family, either a father or a son, was killed. What it became. The Sun Tzu point was, war is the last thing for a general or leader to do. You try to win by intimidating the enemy, getting them to do what you want, but not actually going to war. Now, the hearings, the British had some hearings about the Iraq War, and one of the points was the Americans were so anxious to get started with the war. We wanted to start it so quickly. Another of Sun Tzu's common dictums, there is no instance in history of a country ever having benefited from a long war. Here we are. Try to break your enemy's alliances, his point. Instead of breaking up the alliances of the enemies, we unite them all against us. They think of the Muslims. The best is to take a country whole, not to destroy it. To destroy it is not so good. Fight not, unless the position is critical. The good general is full of caution. That is the way to keep a country at peace and rich, I added, and an army intact. The whole issue with the Muslims, we go back, America used to be very popular in the whole Muslim world because we helped them against the Europeans. What they hated was the French and Germans. First, Kennedy supported Algerian independence against France. We've been on LA in the of course, in the Second World War. But that was recognized all in the Muslim world. When England, Israel, and France attacked Egypt over the Suez Canal, and by the way, the Egyptians had offered to pay for the Suez Canal, but at the price it was selling on the Paris Bourse, which was a stock exchange, which was very low, wasn't a fair price. But in any case, Eisenhower ordered the British back, and they pulled back from that. The American University in Beirut, in Cairo, were the elite universities in the Arab world, and people would send, the elites were sending their children there. This all changed, obviously. We are very much hated today. This all changed. A big part of it was the settlements of Israel and the settlements on the West Bank. There was a peace, remember, with Rabin, and a peace had been worked out, the Oslo Accords. That was undermined as much from within the United States. There's a thing on the internet, you can find A New Beginning, where Netanyahu and some others had the proposal was to get rid of Oslo, and complicated stuff. But anyway, then Iraq, that was still Israel-Palestine, been going on a long time. The Arabs were somewhat used to it. In Iraq, we went in, a country that had done nothing to us when Bush the First attacked Iraq. We had bragged we were bombing it back to the Stone Age, and we did. We bombed it back to the Stone Age. But afterwards, okay, that's war, but afterwards, for 9 years, there was a blockade of Iraq, where we blockaded to prevent the reconstruction. There was a Defense Intelligence Agency report, even before the bombing, saying that if we bombed the irrigation, sanitation systems, there'd be massive starvation and disease. And that's what we did. Okay, they could have rebuilt, but then we blockaded reconstruction supplies, electric motors, anything to do with transportation. This was all blockaded by America for 9 years after the first war. When bin Laden attacked us, it's coming back to Hitler, he's compared to Hitler. You often hear with Hitler, well, he said it, he wrote it all, he said what he was going to do, it's in Mein Kampf. We should have read what Hitler said. Well, what bin Laden said is very hard to find, because the U.S. government doesn't agree with it. And it was always obfuscated, he hates us because we're good, or whatever, as the president said. But bin Laden had 3 reasons. The Americans going into the Holy Land in Saudi Arabia, that's in the first Iraq War, we had American women truck drivers, which they didn't like, but all the American troops, soldiers in their country. Then it was Palestine, Israel, and his 3rd reason was the blockade of Iraq and the devastation to the society. Those were the 3 reasons he gave for attacking us. How are we on?
We're doing good.
Yeah. So that's then it's the way we fight wars. All these countries. Now, I lived 15 years in South America, and one of the things they have in Latin America is dignity. Is the word. The dignity or self-respect is something we don't understand. We, the rest of the world, as Americans, or if you will, English, North European, Germans. The Germans lost all their wars, but there's still tremendous respect for them. In the Third World, people have been colonialized. Having a foreign army in your country, or being in South America very much under our thumb, there's a tremendous insecurity complex. We call it having a chip on their shoulder. When I was in Peru, General Velasco, a leftist general, nationalized, expropriated Exxon Petroleum. And he called that, the day he did that, he called it the Day of Dignity. From their point of view, it was restoring dignity, because the camps, and it was a lot of it from years ago, but the camps would have signs, no Peruvians, no dogs allowed. You know, they're close together. That was on their own country. Nasser, the president of Egypt then, when they asked what did he do, he said, I restored dignity to my people. The dignity thing, we can't understand. I'm a mix of business and journalism, but I was in business with a man who was half Greek and half English, and he'd grown up in England. His mother was English. And he had a story, grown up in Egypt. And he had a story that his mother complained to the British that a taxi driver had been rude to her. And they went out, they found the guy who had been rude and flogged him publicly. So that, I didn't get the details, but the taxi driver was flogged by the British authorities, or in fact by Egyptians under the orders of the British. And you can't understand these countries unless you understand the chip on their shoulder, the feeling, if they've been colonialized. And just think of ourselves, one of those Bill of Rights, one of the few left, is that you can't quarter soldiers in your homes of our people. Well, that was what the British were doing that in 1776. They'd send soldiers to live in the home of the American family. It was such an issue, it's even in the Bill of Rights, one of the few we still have left, actually. The point in understanding the third world is you have to appreciate that resistance. I saw a thing on Iran recently. A man, an Iranian, was saying, well, if they attack us, if America bombs Nicaragua, we have our pride. In Chile, years ago, I was in Chile talking to a Chilean consul, and it was the time of Allende and all the far left in Chile. And I said, well, if you guys want to expropriate an American company, foreign company, with the tax laws and the labor laws, you can take any company. In the end, they'll give it to you. And that happened in Peru with W.R. Grace. They had so much legal liability for retirements to their former employees. They were happy when the government took it over and they got rid of those liabilities. It becomes very big. But anyway, the Chilean, I said, but you can do this. Don't make such a big fuss about it and get America agitated. You could do this with your labor and tax laws. And his answer to me, what do you mean? It belongs to us. We've been expropriated, we've been exploited by the imperialists. He was a leftist. We've been exploited all these years by the Americans. We've got to show that it's ours. And we want to, that was more than taking it over to do it publicly, etc. And I say etc. too much, but you follow, we can't understand that. In Iraq, one of the things the American soldiers would do when they went into the homes of the Iraqis, they'd order the men on the floor to lie down on the floor on their stomachs. And the soldiers would sometimes, they'd put their foot on the back of the man. Lying on the floor in his home, they put their foot on his back. Well, in the Asian culture, it's a tremendous insult to show the sole of one's foot. In a business meeting, you should never cross your legs and where you've got the bottom of the foot facing a person. It's a tremendous insult. Thing we don't know, but doing that to the Iraqis, we made enemies of him, his children, his uncle, his family. Blood enemies that would kill us. They would die to kill an American. Things that we do without a thought. This is the kind of thing that's happened over there. Anyway, you see why some of them hate us. I'd add on terrorism here, a friend of mine is Bruce Fine, who was an assistant attorney general under Reagan, in Reagan's time. You may have heard him. He's very much on the constitutional issues. And he was saying, he was saying in the talk once that he'd read the transcripts of these cases where the FBI has arrested young Muslims who were planning a terrorist attack. So it was in the news. A terrorist attack in America, or different stories. He read the transcripts when almost all of these cases, the FBI, these are young people without facilities. The FBI would give them bombs or weapons, and not things that wouldn't work, like they thought were bombs. The FBI often contributed, instigated this. But what was interesting in the transcripts, when these Muslims were talking to each other, even FBI agents wouldn't say it's Charlie, they want to the Muslims want to bring Sharia law to America, they're going to take away the rights of the women, or whatever. Always, it was about Americans killing Muslims. Look what our people, look what the Americans did in Iraq. Look what they do in Pakistan, or wherever, with the remote bombs. It was always, the inciting these people was always stories about how we were killing Muslims. Anyway, that's in the legal transcript, so obviously these things are not reported very much. Well, after war comes, from our point, losing our liberties. I count the Bill of Rights that we still have 5. If you go through them carefully, you'll see. And several of them ended or have been severely damaged by what happened during these last 10 years. We know the Patriot Act. The big thing with the Patriot Act was the Fourth Amendment. Police can't come into your home or take your papers without a warrant. That was one of the big issues in the Patriot Act and others, but far less known is something called the Military Commissions Act. That was passed by the Republicans in the last year, or 2 years of Bush, I believe, by the Republican Congress. And the Military Commissions Act allows the president alone to declare martial law. Couldn't do that before. The martial law means that the army can run the country, if you will, or run an area. They ended the Posse Comitatus Act, was after the Civil War, that the American army could not go in to occupy a state and such. This was, now the president can declare martial law. The Posse Comitatus Act, where the army could arrest American civilians, is out. One of the things, when I lived in Russia, my mother used to tell me that the secret police, the police and the military, were often a different ethnic group to where they were guarding. In European Russia, many of them were soldiers from the Asian, you had Asian features in their faces, soldiers from different regions. And that's how dictatorship ran, because then if they're shooting at people, it's not part of their relatives or family. One of the things the Military Commissions Act allows the president to take any National Guard unit and move it from one state to another. So if you did, this is very far-fetched, but in America they can take the Alabama National Guard and bring it to Michigan. They're not going to have the same sympathies as the Michigan National Guard. Minor things, but the kind of thing that, why do they have to pass laws like that? Now we have the National Defense Authorization Act, passed a few months ago. Only Rand Paul and Al Franken were objected. Excuse me. And that, under that law, any citizen or resident of America, a citizen, can be arrested without a warrant and held in military confinement if the president says he's a terrorist. I think we're getting close to
We'll let you know.
end. Okay. Let me have a break a second.
Of course, you can trump us at any time.
Yeah, no, sure. I think I want to make a couple comments. What we call the military-industrial complex, in communist times, I used to welcome it, frankly. Somebody cared, and there was, the left was so powerful, it's forgotten, it's 20 years ago, how powerful the left was in those times, telling us it was our fault. And many of us, I was on the Voice of America many years, but we used to think we were on the losing side with the communists. And when I spoke on the Voice of America, again, you can't understand the poverty in those countries. I went to Moscow in '87, the first trip. There was 3 AM radio stations in the whole of Moscow, and no FM radio. You can't believe it or understand what short wave meant in those days. And the military industrial was very small. You didn't have companies like that with buildings in Washington and Virginia with their vast signs, Grumman, Northrop, and things like that. They were all little in the background. Today it's become very powerful. We had a group at CPAC, it's the big conservative meeting once a year in Washington, and a group I'm with, sponsored Susan Eisenhower, the granddaughter of Eisenhower, to speak. And there we showed Eisenhower's speech, his farewell address. And it's an incredibly erudite speech, far above what you hear our presidents use today, with 3-syllable words, even 4. And the speech is in great depth and profundity, really like our founding fathers. And the speech is so much explaining all his reasons, the one about the military-industrial complex. One of the points today, the incredible waste in the defense budget. Now, groups like the Heritage Foundation, Wall Street Journal, op-ed with a conservative commanding heights, all say you can't cut a penny from defense. Well, the waste there, of course, people who've been in the military will tell you, but the way we fight the wars. There was a story in the Post, we spent 250,000 bullets. We fire 250,000 bullets for every guerrilla we kill, or terrorist, as we call them. Every single one. The weaponry, the F-15 fighter plane was manufactured with parts coming in from 44 states. They beat that with the F-35, it's 45 states, actually. And they start building these weapons before they've been tested. The point then is to get a constituency in favor of it, all these suppliers from the different states. And the testing involves changes in the plane, which then you can go back to the manufacturer and they charge who knows when there's any, if you're in construction, anybody you know, and you go back with a small change, with the kind of what they add to the costs. The manufacturing is done before testing. We had Secretary England, who was an assistant secretary under Reagan or Bush, had an article that there are 500,000 to 600,000 civilians in the Pentagon, working in the Pentagon and associated fields. 500,000 to 600,000. He had argued it's the same number as in the communist times we have. Then whatever, to compare the Muslim threat with the communists is incredible. The Soviets had tremendous help within this country. They had nuclear weapons, they had half of Europe, they had an ideology that appealed in much of the third world. I mean, there's no comparison. Those civilians could not be let go because of civil service and union rules and such. The Washington Post had a series. It's not just cutting the Pentagon budget. The Washington Post had a series on the CIA and all the intelligence agencies. They were putting out 50,000 reports every year, 50,000. But it was in print. Then it went into the different intelligence agencies fighting each other on turf battles. The incredible waste. Maybe you saw that Panetta, the secretary, when he was head of the CIA, he was flying back to California in a government plane every weekend. And weekends for them went to start Thursday night and Monday night. There was no mention of it. It wasn't reported. All that money is off budget. Now that he's head of the Pentagon, it is reported, and it came out in the news. It's not just the waste, the arrogance of these guys. We have more four-star generals than we had at the height of the Second World War. The bases we have overseas, it's tremendously expensive for various reasons, rotating the troops to Germany and Korea. We don't agree to keeping those bases. To say there's not money to be cut, and then one of the other things, the military-industrial complex, the profits are in producing the weapons they've already, to produce copies, the same thing they've already been producing. Very little of our money goes for defense. Ron Paul had a speech, was on Morning Joe once, he said it shouldn't be called a defense budget. He said it should be called, half of it should be the militarism budget. if you go on Google, you'll find an article of mine, the militarism budget. And I took out Ron Paul's. Half the budget is defense and half is militarism, attacking foreign countries. Very little. There's a book by a man, Rasmussen in Polster, about what Americans think is the great threats to America. And in it, the majority of Americans think it's cyber warfare. You're reading a bit now what they could do to us. And the budget deficits are the economic threat to our country, going bankrupt. The debts, those are the two threats America faces, not Iran and China is going to attack us or whatever they talk. People are not, when I was a salesman many years, most people are not stupid. They're ignorant because they don't know. They're busy with other things, most people, but they're not stupid. And democracy works, but you've got to get this out. There's a tremendous complex in Washington. We call it the war party. But so many people in Washington prosper from wars, and at least or the threats of wars. But the military-industrial complex is also producing the same weapons that we used to fight the past wars, aircraft carriers and tanks and fighter planes. These are not the issues. And there's very little money for civil defense. One of the real threats, we talk sometimes, is electromagnetic, you have to turn them on. Where a bomb high up in the atmosphere could fry the civilian electronics. And we would starve by the millions without transportation and communication, through bringing food to the cities. There's very little money for the real threats, but they want to produce more planes, more tanks. We have 50 nuclear submarines. We have 13 aircraft carrier battle groups. In fighting the Third World, one nuclear submarine, the British had one, in the Falkland War. It bottled up the whole Argentine Navy. They couldn't get a ship out of port. They were afraid of that one submarine. We have 50, as if the Soviets were still the threat they used to be. All the aircraft carriers, these are not relevant. The MRAP, remember because of our soldiers being killed by mines, we started building the MRAPs. They built 30,000 of them. Now, one of the things in Afghanistan is we can't get them out. They're so heavy. Unless, the supply lines in Afghanistan, we're fighting a war. It costs $400 a gallon to bring gasoline up to the front line troops there. We now have with Pakistan, after we killed some of their people, we bombed them. They don't let our supplies go through. The supplies are going into the Baltic nations, down by railway through the whole of Russia. And then the ammunition, heavy stuff, we are flying in. The cost is unbelievable, and it's not reported. That $400 a gallon was before the Pakistan supply routes were cut, which were bringing in fuel. Anyway, the idea that there's nothing to cut is so preposterous. And the $1 trillion, we have this article in our magazine about China and America, and Ron Unz, our publisher, speaks about what China has built in these last years compared to what we have. In the last 10 years, while we've been knocking our heads against Muslim fanatics in caves, China has built 6,000 miles of railroad track in the last 12 years. Engineers run the Politburo in China, not that we have lawyers run our government. 1,000% increase, and that's 10 times in their real standard of living. That's actually over 20 years. In the last 10 years, their automobile production went from 2 million to 18 million. Think of that $1 trillion in Iraq. It may be 2 or 3 trillion. But think of the $1 trillion in Iraq. That's equal to the entire student loan debt in this country that's really suffocating young people. To put our young people through that, they come out of college with these incredible debts. You know which it is to make enough money after taxes to pay that. What $1 trillion could do that we just blow over there. So when we say our bridges, it's tremendous in the Northeast, and I assume much here. I met a man a diver who researches bridge foundations. He was telling me in New England, all the bridges, most of them were built in the 50s and 60s. A great number need replacement of the foundations. Into that, if you know. This is money, our infrastructure, to be blowing this money on the concept of wars, and then they say, oh, the Iranians are going to, the Muslims are going to come and cut off our right hand or whatever. Oh, I know, not pay us any money on our savings. You might say they've already got the Federal Reserve. That's a joke. Maybe, you know. Anyway, you can do a lot with $1 trillion. And that, I hope that's why we want peace. And please understand all, if I say things you haven't heard before, there's a tremendous promotion of war because it's so much money in it. The vast structure, much of industry, and of course careers in the media. A war is much more exciting than going on and on about, what was it, O.J. Simpson in the old days, or now the black man who was killed by a security guard in Florida. Wars, you know, get a lot of media attention. And of course war, war for us today is, what's it mean for most Americans? War is something you sit in front of your television with a beer, a cup of coffee, and watch other people, missiles going off and our brave fighting men, and the tank goes through the desert in the dust. It's, war is not this very little cost to us, has been. And so it's, of course, professionals, not draftees. War is popular, but of course we are seeing the costs of it already. Okay. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Please remain seated.